Welcome to a discussion on virtualization security. Virtualization and the shared services that come with it always bring security to the top of mind. So with me today are Glenn Brunette, Senior Director, Enterprise Security with Oracle Corporation, and John Kim, Senior Security Consultant with GTSI. So, first question, security is a concern in every aspect of IT. How does it differ in the virtualized world?
Well, in the physical world, very much we're used to be able to walk into a data center where we can put our hands on the actual equipment. We can inspect the network cables and say, well, this network cable is going into this switch at this port. And it gives us much better assurance about how the systems are configured and where they're connected and exactly where they are. Well, in the virtualized world, a lot of that goes away. Now, what we find is that you're dealing with virtual systems that exist somewhere in the data center. They're connected to virtual switches and virtual interfaces that exist and connect them to a variety of different networks. And similar to storage devices and applications. And what's interesting also is that in the physical world, you could walk into the data center, touch the system, and really get a good inventory of that system, exactly how it was configured, the disk configuration, everything about it. But in the virtual world, that's also different. Now, the actual machine configurations are often stored as software files on the disk. And so it brings a whole new dimension to how we need to protect those systems, because now what used to be protected by the walls of the data center and the cameras and the guards and everything else, now needs to be protected on the network.
Well, one of the challenges is having full visibility within the virtualized environment. You can't easily leverage your existing tools today in order to see all the traffic patterns that are happening between different applications and services. Another is that within a virtual environment, you're also working with a storage foundation that's on the same physical application or server. And the thing is, you might have different classification of security requirements based on different organizations and different departments. So you need to be able to address some of the isolation concerns that you have between different data.
So Glenn, is the security of virtualization more a policy and process issue than a technology problem?
I'm not sure I'd characterize it as one versus the other. If we really take a look at security, we find that really it hasn't changed all that much in millennia. You know, the problems that people were trying to solve, you know, with defense in depth, with least privilege, with compartmentalization, with separation of duty, those things have continued to exist for many, many years, and I think will continue for some time to come. What we see is that the way in which those capabilities are implemented continues to evolve. Just as we've evolved from the mainframe world to the minis, from the minis to distributed computing, and all the way out to today with virtualization and cloud computing, we find that we need to evolve the techniques that we use to promote security in our environment. So in that way, I think it is a policy, it is a process, and a technology problem. But I think another point to consider is that due to the opportunities for scale within virtualization, now where you have only maybe 100 physical systems, you could have 10,000 virtual systems. Well, in those cases, you know, when you had a small data center, technology may have been able to mask that problem. You know, you may not have needed the process, the heavy policy, you know, for only that such a small data center or small set of servers. But as you move out to tens of thousands of servers or even beyond, the need for a well-defined structure of policy and process and technology together working in unison becomes even more pronounced, and especially so for organizations that need to satisfy various governance or compliance requirements, because those policy, processes, and technology are all part of the same whole. They need to work in unison in order to achieve those kinds of strategic objectives.
So you've given us a great foundation in terms of approach. So what are some of the problems an organization may run into if they don't follow a holistic approach like the one you suggested?
Well, some of the biggest problems are failure to comply with government mandates or other regulations. They may find that their governance policies really don't have the teeth they need and aren't enforced throughout the organization. So there's certainly some problems at the higher levels and also at the lower levels too. If you aren't able to adequately specify your requirements, your best practices, your processes, you may end up with a real mess in terms of the systems and applications that are in your environment. They may be all configured differently, different patch levels. They may be open and some closed and locked down. You have a real variation there in the environment. And that creates real change management and control management problems.
So when you look at virtualization as a technology, in what ways does virtualization enable you to potentially run a more secure environment?
Well, one of the things is if you look at an approach as managing a project, it allows you to take a step back, re-look at your resources, re-look at some of the things in your budget. It allows you to reassess what your management team is doing, and it allows you to reassess what your operation is doing. And that fresh approach is definitely key. It's taking, you're taking the practice of old ways is not always the best way. So you want to go ahead and it's a fresh look. And perhaps virtualization or moving into a virtualized environment is that type of initiation of doing something new and looking at it. Because we talk about over and over again, we talk about policy. Policy is where a lot of the organization fell. Procedures, using old procedures, old guides, and not refreshing, updating it with current changes that you need to be doing. So I think that's the enabler.
Very good.
I would also add that in terms of security and virtualization, it actually adds a new dimension to the separation of duties argument. Typically, you'll have systems that are providing some service, and you'll have a service administrator, like a web administrator or a directory administrator, that is responsible for running that service. Underlying that is the operating system, and that is the domain of the system administrators and the operators. But now what you're getting with virtualization is the opportunity to actually have a now infrastructure or a cloud or a virtualization administrator that is now responsible for divvying up the hardware assets, ensuring secure compartmentalization between workloads. So you now have an extra level of separation that gives you better control in terms of how you want to allocate resources and services within your environment.
So we often think of security as an end state, a state of being in terms of the environment. As if one were just starting out with virtualization, what first few steps would you give them guidance in on how to approach security in that environment?
Well, you can actually look at using your existing best practice principles that you do now, which is looking at updating your security policies and your procedures. You can look at how you scan and for vulnerabilities periodically. These are things that you have to do anyways. So think about, even if you were to move into a virtualized environment, you don't have to think about having to redo everything. It allows you to reinvest, re-energize, and following the best practice principle that's been out there. And at the same time, once you do your vulnerability scans, you'll be able to identify your assets in your environment anyway. Perhaps you'll find resources or applications or servers that you didn't know you had that you don't need anymore. So you address the vulnerabilities that exist in legacy systems. And that's the biggest concern as well, is legacy systems that you're not going to just be able to move into a virtualized environment and not bring along the legacy environment, because those applications have very specific needs in nature and why they still exist today. So there are some best practice principles that you can do that doesn't require a whole new revamping of your security principles.
What are some of the areas that they should then address or look toward the future?
There's really three core areas that people who are a little more sophisticated, who are happy, and have started to adopt the virtualization technologies that they need to look at. The first is the actual security capabilities of their underlying hypervisor. Now, there's a variety of different hypervisors on the market. Organizations may not even settle on just one. So there will be functional differences, there will be security differences. But they should really take the time to understand what is it that those hypervisors can bring to the table in terms of security. By their very nature, a hypervisor is really supposed to do two core things. One, it mediates access to the hardware, to the physical assets. And most of the hypervisors do that very well. Secondly, it isolates workloads in a secure way. So isolating multiple virtual machines, for example, running on the same system. But beyond that, we have seen some really interesting innovation in the hypervisor market where they've added additional capabilities that allow you to plug in additional security monitoring and control services so that they offer these value-added capabilities. So that's one area that they should look at. The second area is the control plane, how they actually access the hypervisors and how they manage the day-to-day operations of their virtualized environment. One thing, they need to think about having a dedicated management network. Now, in a virtual world, that doesn't mean it's a physical network, but it's at least protected in a way that it's isolated from the rest of the workloads happening in their environment. And so we want to make sure that, as an attacker, that they don't have the opportunity to easily gain access to that control fabric where they can really wreak havoc. It's basically like giving them the keys to the physical data center. And the last area is the virtual machines themselves. The virtual machines, there's a lot of work that we can still do there. In many ways, what we've done for security hardening over the last 5 to 10 years really hasn't evolved greatly. Obviously, different vendors have different capabilities, and it has, security has continued to improve. But we really should use this as an opportunity to look at our operating system platforms and say, well, what are the security capabilities there, and how can we build them into golden images that enable all the security functionality that we want out of the box, so when people want their virtual machines, on demand, self-service, they're able to just click the machine and get security by default.
So I want to thank you, Glenn and John, for your thoughts today on virtualization security. We appreciated learning very much about the foundational aspects that exist in security and how those transpose to the virtual environment from the physical. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today to discuss this important topic of virtualization security.